Hi, this is Amanda.
And this is Jen.
And you're listening to Just This, a podcast that explores everything around being and becoming a mother or parent.
We're excited to have you join us as we dive into the practical details as well as the unseen energetics on topics that span from preconception to years after birth.
So today we are inspired to talk about birth preparation and birth reality. Was that how we described it? Or birth plans versus birth realities?
Yeah, I mean, we in our world call it birth preferences because...
Birth preferences, that's it. Birth preferences versus birth realities. And this was actually an inspired conversation because I saw something which I will happily link in the show notes because, happy to give credit where it's due, from the indie birth community, where they had this blog post and then a podcast that was expanding on it called Birth is Not Like Cabinets or Ordering Cabinets. Yeah, which I thought was so fascinating. And just that little statement, if you've ever gone through birth, most of us would agree is true.
I agree.
And then I mentioned this to Jen, and Jen said this is such a big and important topic at the moment. Mm-hmm. So we thought we'd talk about it.
Yeah, and here we are.
Than what other people are talking about it.
Just to drive it home and the importance of it.
Yeah, I think it is such an important thing, and maybe we're hearing it because we're in the birth world, and we hear in the circles that we are, people talking about it, but maybe you haven't heard that statement, and who knows, maybe our conversation or these resources we share here would be helpful for you. Yeah, do you want to start with why it's such a big topic you feel like right now and why it's so important?
Yeah. Let's see. So I think it's a big topic because we have an attachment to the way that our births will play out. And we put some of that pressure, at least for like a home birth midwife, and even for like nurses and sometimes doctors as well, we put that pressure on them to make the birth go as planned, like as we have laid out on that birth plan or birth preference. And that's just not the reality. And the reality is that we just don't have control over some things. And I tell people this all the time. And actually, they kind of mentioned it a little bit in the podcast. And that's that I find medicine very humbling because there's this aspect that we just don't have control over. And like, for instance, if a mom is hemorrhaging, which is like bleeding after birth, even Western medicine, which we would say is like the, kind of quote unquote God of medicine, like is how we view it in the Western world, can't stop it sometimes. And that's that whole aspect that we just don't have control as people. And I really like that she kind of referenced this in the podcast, that medicine, like these medical people are sometimes foreseen as like gods of whether or not something is the way it is or it's not, like something survives or it doesn't. And that's just not the reality. So I think it's important to talk about. And we also talk about it too in the birth world, in the sense that even people that have really wonderful births, like everything is smooth, there's still times that they have to grieve it because they had this like idea, this plan of how birth should go. Like, for instance, I'll use my birth story a little bit. I wanted to have like a water birth and like, have it all magical and fairy lights and all that stuff. Well, the reality was I was in California. I wanted a home birth and my son was approaching 42 weeks, or I was approaching 42 weeks. And after 42 weeks, there's a cutoff. You can't do home birth. It's then hospital birth. So we waited kind of to those last few days and ended up taking castor oil. Well, if you know what castor oil does, I spent my entire labor pretty much on the toilet. And I got in the tub when the tub was probably, 2 feet high or something of water, and it wasn't even warm. And I'm just trying to swim in this, like, not really like a kiddie pool of water at the moment. And I gotta poo. Like, I can't be in this water. And so I just went back to the toilet. But in some of those cases, people would have to grieve the fact that they just didn't have that water birth, like that the baby didn't come out in the water and there's no like mystical lights and all that. So we just don't have control over how magical or not magical the birth will go.
Yeah, I think it's just a really interesting thing. And she does a really great job in this podcast of addressing, well, if you do have a perfect birth, like, do you not have any part of that or whatever? And was what you did not a part of, there's this balance. And this is where I think it's like, almost like, we get into like the manifestation or whatever, but like energy wise of surrender. Yes, we can like have intentions and be intentional the way we are interacting with things, including our, conception, our pregnancy, and our birth. But then there's also surrender to the unknown, like the mystery of the void, right? Which is what birth is in a lot
Yeah.
of ways. So there is deep surrendering to the unknown, which in some parts is maybe not in your plan.
Yeah. And I think
So,
the unknown is the aspects that we just can't control.
mhm,
It's like we can't, and the other thing too, we still don't even to this day know what causes us to go into labor even. So, and you hear like, for instance, my mom, she said she had Pitocin with me. It didn't do anything to her at all. And on the other end, a Pitocin for somebody else could totally like cause intense pain that they're just like, it's unmanageable and it's just too much. So
yeah. And
it's,
I think this comes back to like really connecting with yourself,
mhm,
because there is nobody that has all the answers. And then also on the flip side of that, connecting to yourself, trusting your wisdom, of
mhm,
course, like take in whatever advice you need, but also really deeply trusting your wisdom and knowing that if the decision you made doesn't have the outcome you expected, if there's no negative or positive attached to that. I think she gets into that. There's no like right or wrong based on some outcome based on your decision. Especially this is your experience. You are the most connected
mhm.
to that child than anyone else around you.
Yeah,
Um, and you don't make a wrong decision if you're making it out of sovereignty, basically, I think, no matter what the outcome is. Uh, it's a really interesting and hard and expansive topic. It's just such birth is a raw experience, and I mean we're talking about like in some cases life and death, literally like in the
it
same
is. Yeah.
breath and sentence.
Yep.
Um and yeah, it's just super fascinating. I agree though, my pregnancy didn't go as well to plan. And I
Mhm.
remember having that moment where I was heartbroken, like I wasn't going to be able to give birth in the birth center,
Mhm.
and just like bawling. Like, there is that little moment of, I have to release this. There are some things, I do know some people who've gone to 44 weeks or beyond and done births at home. There's ways, you can do whatever you want, but like I couldn't make this specific birth center. They were like, no, based on like what's going on with your pregnancy. And my child just wasn't growing at the rate or whatever it was. But intuitively, I was like, things are fine. I mean, it
Mhm.
sucked because my plan had to change. And and again, like coming back to like the more you can surrender to it and own how you're going to respond to it, I think, versus be and try to force, the more we
Yeah,
try to force things to be the way we want them to, that gives you something that you just don't even know you really need at the time.
absolutely. Absolutely. And we talk about it. I think this is also really big in the home birth community because we transfer. And sometimes when we transfer, not all the time, obviously, but sometimes when we transfer, it goes to hospitals. And most home birthers do not want to birth in a hospital, clearly, which is why they're
Mhm.
home birthing, or even in a birth center, they don't want to transfer to a hospital too. And the number one reason in home birth community for transfers is due to maternal fatigue. So the mom is just laboring too long. Labor is like going on 2 days and like no progress is getting made. And so we're just like, a lot of times, like, go to the hospital, get an epidural. You'll most likely wake up, you'll be almost complete, and you're going to push your baby out. And you can get some rest because a lot of times, I mean, your body is physically working, your baby is working, everyone's working. And I've always prescribed to there's all medicine is quote unquote good medicine used at the appropriate time, right? Like it's just we tend to, I think, overprescribe in the Western community, but that's a whole nother topic. But going back to this whole idea of transferring is that when first-time moms transfer, they feel like this is failure on them. And it really isn't. They're just not in control of certain aspects. We've had recently a baby just not descending or dilating mom's cervix. We just couldn't do anything. Like we've tried things, but nothing is working. And so in those cases, we're like, go to the hospital. You've been laboring for almost 3 days. Get some rest, get an epidural. It's like a big thing that I feel is always humbling about medicine is that we just don't have control like we think we do. And she kind of quotes that this aspect of control is actually our ego mind, thinking that we control things. And I think it's true. Like we constantly think we're in control of things, but the reality is we're not, upsetting him or whatever, you know? So yeah. And
It's
I
that
think
way with everything in life. I mean, to take it out of birth here, I love when people feel like they have, like, I have a secure job.
drunk driver could have came and like we could have backed into a car that was speeding by or whatever the case is. And so we just don't have control over those aspects. And that's just like birth. Like we just don't have control over some things. And I think even in life, this is also something I've been playing with is just learning and remembering the things we do have control over and the things we don't. And for the things we don't have control over, like really surrendering, like you said, to that and trying to take it as an experience and a lesson.
Again, everything's like a dance and a balance of I mean, and this is a huge thing with birth too, like honoring the feelings that might come up when things don't go to your plan. Like that's totally needed. Take the time and space, I mean, I've seen this with other people where they want to do vaginal birth and then it ends up having to be a C-section or whatever it is when we move through things. And take the time, honor the feelings that are coming up. And also then, as much as we can, step into our, again, surrender and sovereignty, being like, I'm opening myself to what this experience is offering me, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a balance. Like you can do both. You can grieve and also expand and open and receive at the same time. I want to bring this into conception too, because we haven't talked too much about conception yet, but like whether it's in conception and pregnancy or postpartum, there's usually going to be something, right? That your ups and downs or your hard part is going to be somewhere along the path. I don't think I know one person where it's been like smooth sailing exactly to plan through all three areas of conception, pregnancy, postpartum, like everything was perfect, and so for you, maybe your conception was like right on plan, and maybe your pregnancy and birth did go exactly, and then maybe postpartum you have some things, so it happens for different people at different places. But I think this is a big thing we see with conception, where we're trying to control when this is going to happen or how this is going to happen. And there's that difference. What are we controlling versus what are we putting intention into? We can be intentional about things, but we can't control things. Yeah. Like you said, we just can't.
I feel like too, a lot of people, when they make these birth plans, it's almost like they're like planning a wedding, almost like, okay, so in early labor, I'm going to like bake cookies and wear a dress and an apron and you know what I mean? And chill out and watch TV. And then next we're going to do this. And then when the baby comes, it's going to be like this. What we're experiencing and kind of this inward journey that takes place when you are birthing and to like birth out a baby. And I think for me at least, and I believe, I don't know about your experience, but this whole like aspect of like really kind of shedding layers of ourselves to actually birth out a child. Yeah. And in that we experience trauma, and a really big one that we notice a lot in the birth world, and it's hugely known amongst midwives, at least the home birth midwives, is when somebody has sexual abuse history and how that actually affects them even during birth. And that comes out. We can assist them as much as possible from like a mental emotional state, but sometimes that physical and like spiritual mental connection is not there. And that's another
That's
thing.
like a whole nother podcast we need to do.
It's a whole nother podcast.
Talk on, because this is so important. And being somatic and getting into that before you even give birth.
Right. I'm using that as an example because even if you've done a ton of work on it and you're like, oh yeah, I'm good, that could actually still come up in birth. And that's just one example of traumas that come up. And
Yeah.
even too, fear of becoming a mom or fear of being able to take care of the child, fear of having to go to the hospital, all those things create, that's what it does. And Instagram, is awesome as Instagram is, we like kind of poo-poo Instagram, the birth world. Oh, you want an Instagram birth? Okay, great. Like, how many people get Instagram births? Maybe, I don't know. I don't even know the percentage, but maybe the percentage of actual babies that are born on their actually due date, right? Which is like 5%.
I'm going to bring this in really quick because it made me think, you know me, I'm like always relating birth to plant
Yes.
medicine in some
Yes.
ways sometimes. But think about that. Who would go into like some kind of plant medicine or something like that journey and be like, I'm going to plan how this is going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Can you plan that trip?
No.
Try, like
Try.
maybe you
Yeah.
can, but often it won't go 100% the way you plan it. And again, birth is just like that. You go into it a little bit expecting like this is a mystery. You're going through this really powerful spectrum of the ethers, into our, universal portals that is creating life. There is a lot of mystery that we still, even in the medical and the midwifery world, like there's still so much like we know scientifically, but we don't know.
And there's so much more to be explored. And I think
I
too,
found the
like,
quote. Do you want me to read it?
yeah, just to touch back real quick and then you can read it. I think
Okay.
just to touch back too, like what you're kind of talking about is this idea, if things don't go to plan, don't maybe necessarily try to shift your mind about them being good or bad, and really trying to just really take in that experience for what it is. And if you're upset, then that's fine. If you're pissed off, that's fine. All emotions are valid. I always tell even my son this, all emotions are valid, not all actions are good, or not all actions are valid though, right? Really taking that in, and yeah, just the good and bad, like really disconnecting from like, oh, this is good that I'm in the hospital or that I'm at home. No, it's not good or bad. It's just an experience.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, I meant to have the water birth at the birth center,
Mm-hmm.
and I found out weeks before that wasn't going to happen. And then they wanted to induce, and I mean, I had all kinds of intentions as I was going into this, and also not everything went to plan, but a lot of things, a lot of my preferences, not all my preferences were met, but a
Yeah.
lot of them were. And when I reflect back on it, I'm like, actually, when I look at my intention, it was really actually very much honored. And that's where
Mm-hmm.
we created a whole intention workbook, and it's kind of funny. We created this before we even had the topic to do this podcast, and it actually relates well because go check it out. We'll put the link in the show notes. But the whole point of this workbook and the meditation is to get you into the feelings. And it's like, what do you feel when you have this desired outcome? And you start with that. And so I think that gets back to it, is focusing on these feelings, even when things get a little bit thrown off of what that desired outcome. I want to touch on this briefly. We'll read the quote after. Losing babies.
Yeah.
And you just experienced
Mm-hmm.
something
Couple
with
losses,
that.
unfortunately.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
know I have people I know who have experienced that. There's we can take the blame so much for this stuff. We can take the blame, we can put the blame on others. And I think this is what she was getting at. It as much as we are all intentional about what we're doing or who we want to be or how we're showing up for this life that's coming into this world, whatever our role is, we can't control the ultimate outcome sometimes. Part of just being, and there's some beautiful gifts in modern medicine and the skills, midwives and people that are supporting, but we're not ultimate
Yeah.
gods. As much as we are gods and goddesses, like
Yeah.
we can't be god, like we can be the gods and goddesses of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
In our realities in some ways, but we can never fully control another.
Yeah. We don't have control over who lives or who dies. And I think
Yeah.
even I try to remember that regularly, that we don't have control. And I think medicine sometimes too, as a practitioner, I find that sometimes it makes us feel like, oh, like, hey, I resuscitated this baby and they lived. I saved the baby, right? But the reality of that is no, I did not. I was just there with skills. And there was something outside unforeseen that actually chose whether or not that baby decided to live or pass, right? But in this example, live. So, and I think what happens in medicine is we get in this mindset that, oh yeah, I saved the baby, or
Mm,
I whatever, like I made mom stop hemorrhaging. And it's, the reality is like, no, you were just there with skills, but
mm,
ultimately things are not in our control in that
yeah.
way.
We can't own anybody else's experience,
Mhm.
whether positive or negative.
Yep.
And whatever experience they have is what they're going to have. And yeah, you might play a part in it,
Hmm.
but you're not the ultimate one. The best positive, like the most amazing birth in the world and the worst birth in the world. Yeah, we're there to support and add our energy in whatever way we can. We're not the ultimate decider of the experience that's going to unfold.
Yep.
Um,
Not even as a
here-
mom, unfortunately, to our
yeah,
child, right? I
I
mean,
mean,
that's
this
the
is
reality of it.
talk about lessons to be learned, like as your children grow up, even.
Hmm.
I try to remember this. They are their own soul. Like, I
Hmm.
mean, and this can be so hard, so hard, like as you become a parent. And if your kid does struggle or whatever, to not take that on
Hmm.
personally, in whatever way. Okay, I want to read this quote. So here it is. Was the quote that Marin responded to, and I will share the post she did as well as the podcast she did in the show notes. But this was a quote from somebody else's. There's this idea that you're going to choose your birth like you're choosing your cabinets. We're mammals. This is birth. You want to make good decisions about your care provider and what institution you're going to be in, or not. But you can't choose a happy story. If you think that's what you're doing and you get a shitty, complicated birth, then you're going to feel you made the wrong choice. And that was by Sedgwin Morris, who was a doula, I guess.
So,
And then, of course, Marin responds to that. One thing she says later on in her response is that birth prepares us for life and is a continuation of energy patterns we've already set in motion. Birth happens as life does, unpredictably, not like cabinets, which is kind of what we just touched
yeah.
on.
Yeah. It's
Um,
interesting. I teach a childbirth class, and one of the things one of the kind of like, I don't know, experiments or like kind of like hands-on thing I want to do, don't know the word for it right now, but is to actually have everyone write out birth preference. Imagine like ideal situation and what you want to happen, and then to like take that piece of paper and tear it up, because that's the reality of it.
yes,
I think
yes,
that there's a lot of I get a lot of pushback on this, and I just think that it's not that it has to be that way, but you should also pay attention to how it feels in your body when you tear it up. That's nope, sorry, life happened. That's not going to go that way.
yeah.
How
Feeling
does that
empowered when you
feel?
do it. Yeah,
Yeah, and own those emotions and feel through them, so that way when you do go into birth, and maybe it comes out just like that piece of paper and you're like, great, that was awesome. And maybe it doesn't, but you've already like worked through those emotions a little bit, so that when it happens, you're like, you know what? I'm okay. I'm still an empowered person, and we're going to have this birth, and it's going to happen. We're going to
yeah,
going to
yeah,
walk through this experience however the journey plays
yeah.
out.
I love that. I love that. I'm gonna put that in the show notes too, as like a little exercise reminder. And yeah, again, you can do that for birth or even like preconception.
Mhm.
How you imagine like the perfect conception happening
Yeah.
and perfect pregnancy playing out or whatever it is. Because I think that's another thing people have this idea about, not only just like when they're gonna conceive, but how the pregnancy is gonna be and
Mhm.
everything else. And yeah, I love the ripping it up thing. I,
Yeah.
I don't find that controversial in my mind at all. I find it very practical.
I mean, I burn stuff all the time, so to me it's like, yeah. I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it's
there's something about ripping it though. I mean,
yeah,
burning is
tearing it.
great, but like I
This
do
wouldn't be
feel
burning.
that rip because
Yes.
I feel it's like a more empowering
Yeah.
owning
Mhm.
act. I love that.
Exactly, exactly.
We
So that's
should
my one
we
day
should put
goal.
that out there, and we should just do like once a month, hold a session
Yeah.
where everyone can read it,
And
rip it.
I think even if you've already birthed and your birth didn't go to plan, writing out what you wanted to happen and then tearing that up could also be really like freeing in a lot of
Mm,
ways,
yeah,
as a way of like accepting that, you know what, it didn't go to plan, and that's okay. I can still be empowered by this birth.
yeah,
So it's so interesting because I think even people that have great births, they still grieve, and that's because
yeah,
of this birthing cabinet thing. So, and there's a ton of trauma around birth, and hope one
yeah.
day to like
We
explore that
have
for
we have
people.
another conversation on birth stories that is either come out or is coming out. And I think that's like a nice coupling.
Yeah.
Write out how you wanted it to go rip it up and write out how it did go.
Yeah.
And
And then burn
that's
it.
like you are rewriting the story then. Like it's not, yes, it's happening to you, but you are owning what's happening to you in some way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And the nice thing is when you rewrite it out and honoring it. Yeah. And when you rewrite out what happened, you can change the tone of it, right? It's like those like, have you ever watched the horror movies where they just put on like happy music instead of like scary music, and how funny it actually it is? It's kind of comical. And I'm not saying that that's what you do with your birth, but yeah, just check it out. Like, I'm sure YouTube has some of it.
It'll change my relationship to horror movies.
Yeah, I don't watch them because like I don't like the suspense. But anyways, yeah, I think that even just rewriting it and really being conscious of the words that we choose and the tone that we use and how we kind of like honored and took in that experience, I think could also be really helpful for sure.
And coming back to this whole thing is, when I was listening to her podcast on this, I'm like, it happens more often than people talk about. We don't see that on Instagram, right? We don't see people being like, my birth was horrific. Like, yeah, exactly.
And here's a video of it.
Yeah. And so it is hard to process the feelings. You don't feel connected. And that's why this topic is so good, because it is a mystery. The unknown and the surrender is just a part of the experience, and it's happening to everyone. It's not just you. Your experience, honor it, but if you need to find community, there is community out there. Are spaces, reach out to us, let us know. Like, we will find you a community that you can connect to if you need to process something, with others, or like just talk about your experience with somebody who's had something similar that could understand. So
if we kind of look at our birth plan as a dream, right? This is also, if that didn't go to plan, it's like a death of that dream. So we are in a way like grieving that loss. And sometimes we have to grieve a physical loss of a being or a soul that came in for just a very short period of time, or we're grieving the loss of our dreams or our hopes or whatever the case is. And I think in all of that, it's important to just give ourselves grace and the amount of time that we need to process through that, however that we do that.
Yeah.
I think I just want to say too, one thing that I found really interesting, some woo-woo stuff from her podcast that she mentioned was kind of going back to conception here, was that the father brings in consciousness. Do you remember this?
Like, I 100%, because she mentioned her mentor.
Yeah, I forget her name
now.
Yeah, what? We should look it up. I forget her mentor because the mentor is the one that told her this. Yeah. But I just wanted to repeat it here because I think it's really cool. So that she is saying during conception, the father brings in the consciousness of the being, and the mother with the womb is actually the one that goes out and looks and kind of like picks where the soul comes from, and kind of like holds that in her home. So I don't know. I just thought it was so cool, and I just thought it was interesting. There's all kinds of stuff about the conception, and and then that can even get into like when the consciousness comes into the being, right? When does the soul or whatever
spirit
come
babies.
in?
So we gotta have a conversation about spirit babies.
Spirit babies, I love it. Kind of bringing it back into what we were talking about before. We can also say that, sure, maybe you plan this. We're gonna like have this date, and we're gonna like intentionally call in the soul and all this, and then maybe one night you are like just really passionate and something happened.
We often see that when people are struggling, and it's like when you release your control a little bit, all of a sudden it's just like it just magically happens and people are blown away. Or people go through IVF or some other form of fertility and then all of a sudden conceive a year after giving birth or something. So
I saw it a lot in when I did infertility with acupuncture. So yeah, that's usually one of my things too. I'm like, okay, I think we should just maybe stop and just not try. Just take a break. Just take a break. See what happens. Go enjoy yourselves. Go date each other like you dated when you first started seeing each other, So the planning and things like that.
All right. Any final thoughts here?
Final thoughts. Do the I don't know. Exercise. There you go. Do the exercise. Like write out what you want and tear it up, and really just feel for what it is that comes up, like all the emotions, the thoughts, everything.
Yeah. Do this around birth or do this around anything. wherever you are in life, like even if you've had a child and maybe this is related to your baby or your child, or maybe it's not, maybe it's related to some other area of your life that you are, kind of semi planning out. But yeah, I think with the birth thing, it's super powerful. If you are beyond birth, feel free to expand that practice into something else.
And I kind of wonder, when did we start like making birth plans?
Historically,
Historically, like I don't really, did your mom have a birth plan?
it
Birth
feels
preference?
fairly recent, but I think it
Yeah,
would just depend what community you talk to.
I'm
Um,
curious.
I mean, obviously hospitals probably were not really open to accepting birth
Mhm.
plans or preferences. I mean, even now, like you hear people say, depending on the hospital you go to, like I remember someone telling me, because I was like, oh yeah, I'm writing out my birth plan. And they're like, yeah, nurses just toss that in the trash. Like they'll be like, oh, okay, thank you. And then like secretly go back and just like throw it in the recycle bin. But who knows, like, again, I was like, I don't care if that happens. It was more for me to get clarity on what my
Mhm.
preferences were. And that's where the benefit of it is like, it's
Yeah.
great to do them to get clarity on like what your preferences are. And then
Mhm.
that's also good to be able to release them.
Yeah,
So again, it's a
absolutely.
balance. It's this like
Balance.
unspeakable fine dance with everything. All right. This has been great. I feel
Yes.
like this is just a topic we could talk about for hours.
And one more note before we
Yes.
end here. I do kind of vaguely remember birth plans started mainly for like hospitals and stuff because people would go in, they don't know what they want. As like a home birth midwife, we generally know what our clients want because we just have a different care and we're seeing them prenatally and then at birth. But
Mm,
when you're seeing different providers and then you go into some place to birth where they have no idea about anything about your prenatal care except what's on the chart,
yeah.
that's I think when birth preferences started to come up. Like, oh,
Well,
you want a delayed cord cut or you want skin to skin or
yeah.
whatever.
And on that note, I think actually if you're working with a midwife or a birth center, midwives, so birth centers or midwives, you guys just have that built in. Like you guys have you're asking and you have questionnaires, whether people are writing them out or you're asking and taking notes. So
Mhm.
technically the birth plan is being built through your care. That's
Mhm.
what you're doing.
That's true. That's a good point.
Versus, you are allowing that intentionality to come up versus, having somebody having to like take sovereignty and do it on their own.
Just to kind of bring it back again to remember if you hadn't birthed yet or if you've had, like, remember there's aspects that are just outside of your control. So whatever happens or had happened, just to kind of keep that in mind that there's just some things we can't control.
Yeah, it's the great mystery.
It's a great
It's the
mystery.
great mystery.
Embrace the mystery.
Yes. We'll come back with more expansion on some of this. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of things that came up. We'll do a whole one on birth. We can do a whole thing on just birth preferences or whatever.
Yeah.
But this one is leaning into the mystery.
Hey there, amazing listeners. We just want to say a huge thank you for tuning into our convo on the Just This podcast today. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners, and your continued support means the world to us.
If you enjoyed this episode and found value in it, we would be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform or share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it too. Your reviews and shares not only motivate us, but they also help others discover our show.
We're also all about keeping the conversation going and hanging out with our incredible community. Head over to justthis.site, that's justhis.site, where you'll find additional resources, ways to connect with us, and join the conversation, plus some more goodies.
Thank you again for being a part of the Just This community. We'll be back soon. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself and embrace the wonder as you navigate this extraordinary adventure.